The red maple leaves came down like slow fire over Maplewood, Vermont, spiraling from the old oaks along Birch Lane and settling on the cracked sidewalks as though the town itself was smoldering from the inside out. It was that particular week in October when the air turns honest, cold enough to remind you what warmth costs, clear enough to show you exactly where you stand. Daniel Carter stood at the corner of Birch and Main, one hand pressed flat inside his jacket pocket, fingers curled around the last bill he owned in the world. $18. He had counted it twice on the walk from the warehouse district. 2 tens would have been fine. A 20 would have felt almost generous. But 1818 was the precise, humiliating number that the universe had chosen to hand him on the worst morning of his adult life. He was trying to run the math in his head. Groceries for 3 days, milk for Lily, the electric bill that was already 10 days past due. $18 did not solve any of those problems. It barely bought time. That was when he saw her. She was sitting at the Maple Street bus stop, the old one with the rusted green bench and the cracked plastic roof that had never been replaced after the ice storm 2 winters ago. She sat very still, a small wheeled suitcase between her knees, wearing a tan coat that was far too thin for the temperature. She was not crying. That was the first thing Daniel noticed. People in genuine despair often stop crying long before the crisis ends. They go quiet instead, the way a fire goes quiet right before it burns out. She was staring at nothing in particular. Just the middle distance of a bad afternoon. Daniel almost kept walking. He almost told himself it was not his problem, that he had his own daughter to think about, that $18 was $18, and he had no room for anyone else's emergency. He almost did what most people do in that situation, which is look away at the right moment and let the moment pass. But he stopped instead. He stopped, and he asked if she was all right, and she said she was not. And he stood there on that corner with the maple leaves coming down around them, and he listened. And then he did something that made no logical sense at all. He gave her everything he had. He did not know her name. He did not know her story. He only knew that she needed it more than he could calculate. The next morning, 5 black SUVs rolled slowly up Birch Lane and stopped in front of his house. The layoff had come at 7:45 in the morning, delivered in a beige conference room by a man named Greg Holloway, who had the look of someone reading from a script he did not write and did not believe in. Greg was the operations manager at Northeast Transit Solutions, a mid-sized freight company headquartered in a low industrial building on the outskirts of Maplewood. He had been Daniel's manager for 3 years, and in that time they had never been friends, but they had been respectful. That morning, the respect was gone. The missing shipment had been discovered the previous afternoon. 43 units of medical monitoring equipment contracted to a regional hospital network had vanished somewhere between the NTS receiving dock and the delivery trucks. The paperwork showed Daniel had processed the intake. The security logs showed a gap, and Marcus Reed, the floor supervisor who had been quietly inflating his own numbers for the better part of 2 years, had spent the previous evening building a very clean and very false paper trail that pointed directly at Daniel Carter. Daniel sat across the table from Greg and tried to explain. "I processed those units at 4:30 Tuesday afternoon," he said. "I logged every serial number. I can show you the intake sheet." "The intake sheet you're referring to has been reviewed," Greg said, not looking up. "There are discrepancies. There are discrepancies because someone altered it after I submitted it." Greg finally looked at him. The look was not unkind, but it was final. The decision had already been made somewhere above Greg's pay grade, and Greg was simply the person assigned to deliver it. "Daniel, I'm going to have to ask you to return your badge and your key card. You'll receive your final paycheck within 72 hours. HR will be in touch about COBRA coverage." Daniel did not raise his voice. He had been raised by a woman who believed that losing your temper in a losing situation was a form of surrender, and some lessons go all the way down to the bone. He stood, pushed in his chair, set his badge and keycard on the table with a soft double click, and walked out of the building into the October morning. The walk home was 40 minutes on foot. He had driven to work that morning, but his truck was in the shop. The alternator had died on Sunday, and the repair was going to cost $420 that he did not have, and the truck would sit there until he figured something out. He had taken the bus to work for 3 days running. Now he walked. He walked through the warehouse district, past the loading docks and the chain-link fences, and the smell of diesel and cold pavement. He walked through the residential blocks where the houses got smaller and closer together, and the yards had things in them: bicycles, ceramic pots, a child's wagon on its side that spoke of people living real and complicated lives at close range. He walked until he reached the corner of Birch and Main. He stopped there and did the math. The checking account had $11 in change. He had a 20 in his wallet, but he had already used 2 of it at the vending machine at the warehouse that morning, before any of this had happened, because Lily had needed an apple juice and he had forgotten to pack one, and you cannot send an 8-year-old to school without something to drink in her bag. So, $11 in the bank, and 18 in his wallet, and a truck that would not move until he found $420 from somewhere. Lily got out of school at 3:15. He needed to be there. He needed milk. He needed to figure out dinner. He needed to not panic in a way that his daughter could see, because Lily was 8 and perceptive in the way that children raised by a single parent often are alert to the frequencies adults transmit when they think they're broadcasting silence. He was standing there sorting through all of it when he noticed the woman at the bus stop. Her name, though he would not know it until the following morning, was Victoria Hale. She was 38 years old, the founder and chief executive of Hale Logistics Group, and she was worth, at a rough estimate, somewhere north of $40 million. None of that was visible at the Maple Street bus stop. The tan coat was intentional, a plain one she had bought at a Goodwill store in Burlington 2 days earlier, specifically because it looked like nothing. The small suitcase held a change of clothes, a notebook, and a prepaid phone she had purchased with cash. She had been doing this for 4 months. The idea had started as a conversation over dinner with her company's chief operating officer, a sharp and skeptical man named Patrick Lowe, who had looked across the table at her one evening in June and said, "You know what your problem is, Victoria? You hire people the way other people buy furniture. You look at the catalog, you pick the style you want, and you never see it in an actual room until it's already in your house." Patrick had meant it as a critique of her hiring process. Victoria had spent a week turning it over before she understood that he was right about something larger. She had built Hale Logistics from a 2-truck operation into a regional powerhouse over 15 years, and somewhere in the process, she had lost the ground-level sight lines. She knew her numbers cold. She knew her contracts, her clients, her market position. What she did not know, what she had realized she had no reliable way of knowing, was what her people were actually like when no one was watching. The internal audit that spring had found irregularities, phantom invoices, equipment that appeared in the receiving logs but never in the warehouse inventory. Someone was stealing from her, steadily and carefully, and the forensic accountants could identify the shape of it, but not the source. The trail kept going cold at the mid-management level, which meant the theft was being orchestrated by someone who understood the systems well enough to work around the monitoring. So Victoria had done something her lawyers had strongly advised against. She had gone out into the world, not as an executive, not with a security detail, as a woman in a plain coat with a suitcase and no money and nowhere obvious to be. She had visited 6 of her company's 7 regional hubs over 4 months, arriving as a stranger, watching how people behaved when they thought no one significant was looking. She had seen things that troubled her. She had also seen, more rarely, things that gave her hope. Maplewood was the 7th location. She had spent 2 days watching the transit hub that NTS, one of Hale's contracted carriers, operated out of the warehouse district. She had identified the behavioral patterns that matched what the auditors had been tracing. She had the information she needed. She was supposed to be back in Boston by Thursday, but the rental car had a slow leak in a rear tire, and she had not noticed until she was stranded on the highway shoulder 3 miles from town, and the roadside service had taken 2 hours, and by the time they got her moving again, it was late afternoon, and the tire was a temporary patch, and the service station in Maplewood said they could not fit her in until morning. She had asked about hotels and been told the nearest one was 12 miles out on the interstate, and the clerk had shrugged when she'd asked about taxis, and her prepaid phone had a dead battery, and she had walked to the bus stop because the transit map on the shelter wall said there was a route to the interstate. The last bus had left at 4. She was sitting with that information when Daniel Carter stopped on the sidewalk and asked if she was all right. He was a tall man, lean in the way of people who work physically and don't think about it, with dark hair going a little gray at the temples and the kind of careful, watchful expression that people develop when they have been surprised by bad news enough times to stay ready. He was wearing a gray zip-up jacket with a name patch on the chest, the kind of jacket that comes with a job, and he had clearly just come from somewhere difficult. The set of his shoulders said so. Victoria told him the situation. Briefly. No car, no working phone, no bus. She left out the $40 million. She left out the company. She said she was in town for work and had gotten stranded and was trying to figure out her next move. How much is a cab to the interstate? Daniel asked. The clerk said around 15. $16. If I can find one. She watched him think. She had spent 4 months watching people in exactly this kind of moment. The moment when someone else's problem becomes visible, and the person in front of you has to decide what kind of person they are going to be about. Most people were not bad. They were just busy, or tired, or running their own calculations that took up all available space. She did not hold it against them. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket. He looked at what was in his hand for a moment, just a moment, and then he held it out to her. This is 18, he said. It's what I've got. It should cover most of it. Victoria looked at the money. She looked at him. You don't have to do that. I know. I'm a stranger. Everybody is, until they're not. She started to say that she could not take it, that she would find another way, that she was fine, and then she stopped, because she had been watching people for 4 months and she had gotten good at reading the gap between what someone says and what it costs them to say it. This man was not fine. He had just walked away from something hard, and he was offering her everything he had left anyway. She took the money. She watched him walk away up Birch Lane, and she read the name printed on the back of his jacket in the fading afternoon light. D. Carter. She noted it in the small notebook she kept in the inside pocket of her plain tan coat. Daniel had managed to borrow $20 from his neighbor, Mrs. Elaine Prescott, who was 71 and kept an emergency envelope in the kitchen drawer, and never asked questions, just pressed the bill into his hand and said, "You'll square it when you can." And he had bought milk and pasta and a jar of tomato sauce and gotten to school on time. Lily had sensed something anyway. She was a compact, serious child, with her father's dark hair and her late mother's gray eyes, and she had been reading people since she was old enough to read anything at all. She climbed into the front seat he had started letting her sit up front when she turned 8, which she had accepted as her due, and studied his profile for a moment before asking what was wrong. "Just a long day," Daniel said. "Did something happen at work? We can talk about it later." Lilybug. She accepted this in the way she accepted most things, with patience and a careful kind of waiting that suggested she was not done asking, just choosing her moment. She turned to the window and watched the maple trees go by, and Daniel drove Mrs. Prescott's borrowed sedan. She had lent him that too, a few weeks back, while the truck was at the shop, on a vague, indefinite loan that neither of them put a timeline on, and tried to think about pasta sauce, and not about the fact that he had no income and $18 less than he'd started the day with. That night, after Lily was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and worked through what he had. The numbers did not work. They had not worked before, exactly, but there had always been the next paycheck to serve as the horizon. Now, there was no paycheck. There was the emergency fund, which was $430, just enough to cover the truck and leave him $10, which was a dark kind of irony. There was unemployment, which he would apply for in the morning. There was the question of what to tell Lily, and when, and how. He was still sitting at the table when he fell asleep in the chair. The sound of engines woke him at 8:20 the next morning. It was not the sound of a single engine. It was layered, low, approaching in a sequence that had a deliberate quality to it, the sound of vehicles moving in coordination. Daniel pushed back from the table, his neck stiff from the chair, and went to the front window. The first black SUV was already pulling into the driveway. The second was parking along the curb. By the time the third and fourth and fifth had come to a stop, they had taken up the entire block in front of his house, and Daniel was standing at the window with the specific disorientation of a man who has not had enough sleep and is trying to determine whether he is in some kind of serious trouble. "Daddy." Lily was at the top of the stairs, hair still messy from sleep, holding her stuffed rabbit by one ear. She looked at the vehicles, then at him. "Daddy, are we in trouble?" "I don't think so," Daniel said, which was what he said when he was not certain. He went to the front door. The men in suits who had climbed out of the vehicles were not police. Wrong energy, wrong clothes, wrong way of standing. They were the organized, invisible kind of professional that private organizations send when they want to make an impression without making a threat. They arranged themselves with practiced casualness near the vehicles. Then the rear door of the center SUV opened. The woman who stepped out was wearing a dark charcoal blazer and had her hair up, and she looked entirely different from the hollow-eyed figure at the bus stop. But Daniel recognized her immediately. The eyes were the same. The composure was the same, that particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have gotten very good at watching without being watched. She walked to his front door and stopped 3 feet away. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I owe you $18 and an explanation." She told him most of it standing on his front porch, while her people waited at a respectful distance and Lily watched through the living room window with enormous eyes. The name on the business card her assistant offered was not a surprise, not exactly. Daniel had heard of Hale Logistics. Everyone who worked in regional freight and transport had heard of Hale Logistics. They were the company that had expanded into Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine over the last decade, and now handled contracts that the smaller carriers like NTS had been bidding for and losing. Victoria Hale had a reputation as someone who built things correctly and ran them accordingly. That was the word in the industry. Correctly. What Daniel had not known was that she had been in Maplewood specifically because of what was happening at NTS. Hale Logistics uses Northeast Transit Solutions as a third-party carrier for our northern New England corridor, Victoria said. 3 years ago, that was a fine arrangement. 12 months ago, we started seeing losses that didn't match transport variance. Small losses at first, then larger ones. Our forensic team traced the pattern to the NTS Maplewood hub, but the paper trail kept redirecting. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "To someone at the floor supervisor level," he said. Victoria looked at him steadily. "To someone who understood the intake documentation well enough to alter it." "Yes, Marcus Reed," Daniel said. She did not confirm or deny. She said, "I was in Maplewood to observe the operation at ground level. I've been doing that at several locations. The protocol is to go in without visible connection to the company, so that behavior isn't adjusted for my presence. You were testing people. I was watching people. There's a difference. Tests imply a right answer. I was looking for character. It presents itself differently, usually when someone thinks they have nothing to gain and nothing to lose." Daniel leaned against the porch railing. Behind him, through the window, he could see Lily had sat down on the couch and was hugging the rabbit and watching with the focused attention she brought to anything she considered important. "I had nothing to give you," Daniel said. "That was genuinely everything I had. I know. I'd been watching long enough to know what that jacket meant, and what the day had likely looked like for you." She paused. I also know about the termination, and I know why it happened, and I know who made it happen." The silence that followed was the specific silence of something clicking into place. "I didn't come here to thank you," Victoria said, "though I am grateful. I came because I have a problem that I think you can help me solve, and because you're someone I'd like to have on the right side of it." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the legal pad on the kitchen table and the numbers that didn't add up. He thought about Lily at the window. "Come inside," he said. "I'll make coffee." She came in. Her people stayed on the porch. Lily, from the couch, studied Victoria Hale with the focused diplomatic neutrality of a child reserving judgment, which was about as serious an evaluation as an adult was likely to face. The coffee was the grocery store brand, and Victoria drank it without comment, which was the first thing that put Daniel at ease. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he had fallen asleep the night before, over a legal pad of problems, and Victoria laid out what she needed in plain language. She was not soft about it. He had noticed that about her. She spoke as though she expected to be understood the first time, which in his experience was either arrogance or genuine efficiency, and in her case was clearly the latter. Hale Logistics was in the process of restructuring its northern New England carrier relationships. The NTS situation had accelerated a decision that had been coming for a year. She was going to bring more of the freight operation in-house. That meant building an internal logistics oversight function, a team that would monitor compliance, verify intake documentation, track chain of custody for high-value shipments, and identify irregularities before they became losses. She needed people to build that team, people who understood how freight actually moved, people who understood intake documentation from the inside. "I'm not offering you a job because you gave me $18, Victoria said. "I want to be direct about that, because I expect directness back." "Then why?" Daniel asked. "Because I spent 4 months watching people in situations like yours, caught between pressure and principle, and the overwhelming majority of them chose the path of least friction. They looked the other way. They told themselves it wasn't their problem. They made small accommodations that, over time, became the kind of corruption you end up with." She set her coffee cup down. "You didn't do that. You got framed because you wouldn't falsify documentation. And then on the worst day of your adult life, you gave the last of what you had to someone who wasn't asking for it." She paused. "I build things to last. The only way to build things to last is to build them with people who behave the same way, whether or not anyone's watching. That's what I need." Daniel looked at his coffee. "I don't have a business background," he said. "I haven't sat in meetings. I don't know how corporations work from the inside. I'm aware. You'll learn. The corporate mechanics aren't complicated. The character piece is the part you can't teach, and you already have it." She met his eyes. "I need someone who understands warehouse operations from the floor up, who can look at a receiving log and know within 30 seconds whether the numbers tell a true story, who has spent enough time in that environment to recognize when something is wrong because it feels wrong, not just because a spreadsheet flagged it." "You're describing the job I had," Daniel said, "except someone was stealing money and framing me for it." "Yes. I'm asking you to do that job again. But this time, working for the person who actually wants the thefts stopped." There was a pause. From the direction of the living room came the sound of Lily talking quietly to her rabbit, a running commentary she maintained throughout most of her waking hours, addressed nominally to the stuffed animal, but clearly intended for the universe at large. Daniel said, "What happens to Marcus Reed? That's part of what I'd like your help with." He nodded slowly. "Once. Then I'll help." He started on a Monday, which was 9 days after the morning on the porch. In those 9 days, several things had happened. Victoria had contacted Northeast Transit Solutions at the executive level to formally dispute Daniel's termination, which had put Greg Holloway into the specific kind of professional vertigo that comes from discovering that a decision you were handed from above has blown back from a direction you did not anticipate. The termination paperwork went into legal review. Daniel's access to his NTS personnel file was restored for purposes of the dispute, and Daniel signed a consulting agreement with Hale Logistics Group. The offices were in Burlington, a 40-minute drive from Maplewood, in a building that was newer and quieter than Daniel had expected, all clean lines and real wood accents and windows that looked out over the Winooski River. He had worn the best clothes he owned, which were the slacks and button-down he kept for Lily's school events, and he had noticed, without mentioning it, that nobody looked at him as though he were dressed wrong. Victoria's internal compliance team was small, 3 people, not counting her. A data analyst named Bridget Calloway, who was methodical and spoke in complete sentences and appeared to have committed the entire Hale financial history to memory. A former transportation inspector named Owen Marsh, who had 30 years of logistics experience and the specific patience of people who have spent decades finding things that other people hoped would stay hidden. And now Daniel. Bridget walked him through the data on the first morning. The pattern, once you knew what you were looking for, was not subtle. It was carefully designed to be invisible to automated monitoring, which it mostly had been for nearly 2 years, but to someone who had spent years on a warehouse floor, the signatures were recognizable. Intake logs that showed receiving timestamps clustered in the last 10 minutes before shift change, when floor supervision was lightest. Serial number sequences that were logged in the wrong order. A small thing, meaningless to anyone who had not spent years learning how freight actually moved through a dock, but obvious to someone who had. Outbound paperwork that matched the incoming logs except for quantities that had been adjusted by amounts small enough to fall within normal variance thresholds. Daniel sat with the data for 2 days. On Wednesday afternoon, he went to Victoria's office. "The missing units in the hospital equipment shipment," he said. "The ones I was blamed for. They didn't disappear in transit. They were diverted at intake before they ever hit the main floor. The receiving log I submitted was accurate. The log that replaced it, the one with the discrepancies, was created 9 hours after I submitted the original." He slid a printout across her desk. "The metadata on the replacement document has a user ID. That user ID belongs to a terminal in the floor supervisor's office." Victoria looked at the printout. She looked at him. "How long have you had this?" "Since this morning." Bridget helped me pull the document metadata. It was in the system the whole time. Nobody looked. He paused. Or nobody who was looking wanted to find it. She picked up her phone and called Patrick Lowe. "Get me a conference room for Friday afternoon," she said. "Full board access. And call our legal team." She paused. "Yes." The meeting on Friday was not a surprise to Marcus Reed, which was deliberate. Victoria had asked Greg Holloway to invite him under the pretext of a carrier relationship review, a routine enough pretense that Reed had no reason to prepare for anything other than a tedious, quarterly discussion. He arrived in a good blazer, and with the specific confidence of a man who had spent 2 years successfully concealing his crimes and had begun to believe that the concealment was permanent. He shook hands. He made small talk. He sat down at the long table in the conference room at NTS's administrative offices and looked at the assembled faces Holloway. 2 NTS executives, Victoria Hale's legal representative, and Daniel Carter, and the confidence shifted. Daniel watched it happen. He had known Marcus Reed for 3 years. He had watched Reed manage the dock with a hand that was firm in public and accommodating in private. The kind of supervisor who found ways to reward people who didn't ask questions. He had never liked him. He had not, until recently, understood why. Victoria's legal representative, a composed woman named Sandra Ellsworth, ran the meeting without drama. She did not make speeches. She laid documents on the table in sequence, the original intake log with its timestamp, the replacement document with its metadata, the financial records showing the wire transfers, the inventory reconciliation that demonstrated precisely where the diverted goods had gone and what they had been sold for. Each document was accompanied by a chain of custody that was unimpeachable. Reed tried to speak twice. The first time, he suggested that the documents might have been misinterpreted. Sandra Ellsworth pointed to a specific data field and said, "Walk me through your interpretation." He did not. The second time, he began to say something about a former employee with a motive to, and Daniel said, quietly but clearly, "The metadata timestamp is 9 hours after I logged out of the system for the day. My access log shows me off-premise. The replacement document was created by someone who was still on site." After that, Reed was quiet. Sandra Ellsworth summarized the findings for the NTS executives in language that was precise and not unkind. The matter was being referred to the relevant authorities. The company would cooperate fully. Daniel Carter's termination was being formally disputed, and the evidentiary basis for it had been demonstrated to be fabricated. When it was over and the room had mostly cleared, Victoria found Daniel in the hallway. "How are you doing?" she asked. He thought about it for a moment. "I'm okay," he said. "I thought I'd be angrier. Mostly I'm just tired." "That's what's normal," she said. "The anger burns fast. The tired lasts." He nodded. "You've been here before, more than once." She paused. "You did good work this week, Daniel. Clean, careful work. The kind that sticks." He looked out the window at the parking lot. The October light had gone thin and pale, the way it does in the last weeks before winter moves in and removes all the color from the world. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we rebuild the parts that were broken," she said, "starting with the people who held them together when they weren't supposed to have to." October gave way to November, and the work became its own kind of rhythm. Daniel drove to Burlington 3 days a week and worked from home the other 2, which had required a conversation with Lily about why he was home during the day more often, and why his truck was finally back from the shop, and why things seemed different. He had told her the truth in the version appropriate for 8. The job he had was gone, but he had found a better one, and it would be okay. She had accepted this with characteristic seriousness. "Is the new job with the lady who came with all the cars?" "Yes." "She seemed smart," Lily said, and went back to her homework. Victoria came to Maplewood twice that November. The first time was business. She needed to review a site assessment of the NTS dock, which was in the process of transitioning to Hale operational management, and Daniel was the most relevant person to walk her through it. They spent 3 hours on the floor with clipboards and flashlights checking things that had been neglected, and Victoria asked questions that demonstrated she had not forgotten what warehouse floors smelled like, or how long it took to move a pallet with a broken jack. Daniel found this not disarming, exactly, but clarifying. It revised his understanding of who she was. The second visit was not business, or not entirely. She knocked on his door on a Saturday afternoon while Lily was home from school, and she had brought a paper bag with 2 containers of soup from a restaurant in Burlington that Lily immediately declared to be the best thing she had ever eaten, which was the kind of endorsement that could not be purchased and settled certain questions about the visit's success immediately. They ate at the kitchen table. Lily talked about her class's study of New England geography and the various Vermont rivers, and whether rivers were rivers if they froze over in winter or became something else. Victoria said she thought rivers were rivers all year round. They just expressed it differently in cold weather, which Lily found philosophically satisfying. After dinner, while Lily drew at the table, Daniel and Victoria sat with decaf coffee in the living room. The house was quiet except for the sound of Lily's pencil. "You know," Victoria said, "I've had dinner in a lot of restaurants, in a lot of cities, and I cannot remember the last time I sat at a kitchen table with someone and just ate soup. That's a thing that happens when you get used to having people around you who are paid to make things perfect," Daniel said. "Real food stops tasting like anything." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about that, about what I've gotten used to." He did not ask her to elaborate. He had learned, in the weeks of working alongside her, that she organized her thinking out loud, sometimes not asking for response, just listening to herself. He let her do it. "My father built things with his hands," she said. Houses, mostly. He used to say that anything worth building takes longer than you want it to and costs more than you planned. He meant it as a complaint, but I think he was wrong. I think that's just what it means to build something real. Lily looked up from her drawing. "What are you building?" she asked, with the directness of a child who has followed an adult conversation and found the natural question at the end of it. Victoria looked at her. "I'm not sure yet," she said. "I think I'm still figuring out what I need." Lily appeared to find this an adequate answer and returned to her drawing. Daniel, over his coffee cup, said nothing, but he looked at Victoria Hale in the lamplight of his small living room and thought that there were certain things that only became visible at close range and in imperfect light. That had been true of the intake logs. It was true of other things too. There is a particular kind of honesty that only arrives late. Not the honesty of declarations, those tend to come early, when feelings are simple enough to name cleanly. The late arriving kind is more complicated. It shows up in the pauses in conversations that have been going on for a while, in the things you notice yourself doing without having decided to do them. Calling someone on a Tuesday evening for no specific reason, saving an article because you know they would find it interesting. Feeling the absence of a person in a room before you've fully admitted to yourself that their presence was the thing making the room good. Daniel noticed it in himself sometime in December. The way you notice weather changing not as a sudden thing but as an accumulation of small signs that all point in the same direction. He noticed that he thought about Victoria's assessments of things before he made decisions. He noticed that Lily had started drawing her in her pictures without being asked. He noticed that the 40-minute drive to Burlington had become, at some point, a thing he looked forward to rather than endured. He did not say any of this. He was a careful man. He had been a careful man for several years since Sophie had died, when Lily was 3, of a blood clot that arrived without warning and left without explanation. The way the worst things do. He had learned carefulness as a form of protection, and he had gotten very good at it, and he was not sure he knew how to be careless in the ways that mattered. Victoria, for her part, was navigating her own version of the same terrain. She had built the company alone. She had made the decision, early on and not entirely consciously, that the company was the thing that got the full version of her, and that personal life, friendships, relationships, the whole complicated category of things that required vulnerability and continuity and the willingness to be known, would get what was left over. That had been a workable arrangement for a long time. It was less workable than it used to be. The conversation that changed things was not dramatic. They were working late on a Thursday in December, going over the first quarterly compliance report for the newly restructured Hale Northern operation, and it was past 8, and the Burlington office was empty, and Daniel had ordered Thai food from a place 2 blocks away that Bridget Calloway had recommended, and that had turned out to be unexpectedly good. Victoria said, "Somewhere between the second container and the reports. Can I ask you something personal?" "Sure," Daniel said. "Do you regret it? Giving me that $18, knowing what it cost you that day?" He thought about it. "No," he said, "but not for the reasons you probably think." "What reasons then?" "Because I'd already been treated like someone whose character didn't matter, and I didn't want to prove them right by acting like it." He paused. The money was almost beside the point. The question was who I was going to be at the end of the worst day I'd had in years. I wanted to answer it the right way. Victoria was quiet for a moment. "That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in a long time." "You run a company," Daniel said. "People say what they think you want to hear." "Yes. Everyone does." She looked at the papers in front of her, then back at him. "You don't." "No. I noticed that very early on." She paused. "It's alarming, actually. I've gotten so used to people managing what they say around me that when someone doesn't do it, I don't know what to do with it." "You listen," Daniel said. She smiled at that, a real smile. Not the controlled professional version, but the slightly surprised kind that comes from being told something simple and accurate about yourself. "I'm not good at this," she said. The gesture was vague and included the room and the food and the conversation and probably several other things. "Neither am I," Daniel said. "I've been not good at it for about 5 years. What changed?" He thought about how to answer that. "A woman in a tan coat sat down at a bus stop," he said, "and I found out she was worth more attention than I knew how to give her." The silence after that was the comfortable kind. Outside, the Burlington streets had gone quiet, and the windows showed the dark river and the first December stars, and neither of them reached for the compliance reports again that evening. The red maple leaves came down again over Maplewood the following October, moving in the same slow, spiraling way they always did, as though the town were replaying a scene it particularly liked. Things were different, and also recognizably the same, which is, after all, the best kind of change. The house on Birch Lane had a new front door, forest green, that Daniel had installed in the spring. The truck was running. Mrs. Prescott had been repaid 3 times over, and had used the extra to get her kitchen faucet fixed, which had been dripping for 7 months. Owen Marsh from the Burlington team had become someone Daniel called a friend in the proper sense of the word, not the attenuated professional sense. And they had season hockey tickets. Hale Logistics had absorbed the NTS Northern Corridor operation. The compliance function that Daniel ran had, in its first full year, identified and closed 4 separate chains of theft totaling roughly $230,000. Victoria had presented the results to the board in September without making a speech about it. The numbers spoke for themselves, which was her preferred mode. Marcus Reed was in the middle of a legal process that would take another year to resolve, which was how these things went. Daniel had given his deposition, been professional about it, and stopped thinking about Marcus Reed as much as it was possible to stop thinking about someone who had tried to dismantle your life. Lily was 9 now, 2 inches taller, obsessed with astronomy since a school field trip to a planetarium in Burlington in March. She had a poster of the Milky Way on her bedroom wall and had taken to going outside on clear nights and identifying constellations with a small flashlight and a star chart, which was the kind of serious childhood hobby that Daniel suspected would either fade in 3 months or last a lifetime. He was quietly betting on the latter. The wedding was small, which had been both of their preferences. Not small because they lacked people who cared about them. The Hale Logistics team came Patrick Lowe and Bridget Calloway and Owen Marsh, and a handful of others who had watched the whole year unfold from various angles and had opinions about how it was going to end. Mrs. Prescott came, in her good coat, and sat in the front row and cried in the way of people who are very happy and don't mind who knows it. Daniel's older sister Claire drove down from New Hampshire with her husband and their 2 boys. A few of Daniel's old colleagues from NTS, the ones who had not known what Marcus was doing, which was most of them, came quietly and sat in the back rows. It was an outdoor ceremony, in the park off Maple Street, 3 blocks from the bus stop where it had started. Victoria had picked the location, and she had not explained why, and she did not need to. Lily was the flower girl. She had taken the job with the seriousness she brought to everything, practicing her walking pace for 2 weeks beforehand in the hallway of the house on Birch Lane. On the day itself, she walked the aisle with the measured solemnity of a professional, scattering white and yellow petals with even spacing, and then broke into a full sprint to reach her father at the end, and took her place at his side with an expression of profound accomplishment. The ceremony was brief. They had written their own vows, not because the traditional ones were insufficient, but because there were things specific to this particular story that the traditional ones had not been written to cover. Daniel said, "I've spent a long time being careful, too careful, in some ways. You made me want to be less careful. That's the best thing anyone has done for me in a very long time." Victoria said, "I built things my whole life because I thought building was the point. I didn't understand that the point was having someone to sit with when the building is done. Now I do." The officiant, a woman named Ruth Hepburn, who was also the town clerk and performed Maplewood's small ceremonies with the warmth of someone who had been doing this long enough to mean every word, said the words that made them married. Lily, from Daniel's side, said finally in a voice just loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear, which produced the kind of laughter that breaks open a room. In the reception afterward, tables on the grass, a local catering company, more food than anyone could reasonably eat, Mrs. Prescott found Daniel by the apple cider table and held his hand for a moment and said nothing, which was the right amount. Patrick Lowe gave a toast that was 3 minutes long and both funny and accurate, which is the ideal toast. Bridget Calloway danced, which surprised everyone, including Bridget. At some point in the late afternoon, when the light had gone that particular amber gold of an October Vermont afternoon at 4 o'clock, Victoria found Daniel standing at the edge of the park, looking down Maple Street toward the bus stop. She stood beside him. "You're thinking about it?" she said. "Little bit," he said. She took his hand. They stood there for a moment in the warm amber light, watching the maple leaves drift down the quiet street. $18, she said. $18, he agreed. Behind them, Lily was running across the grass with 2 of Daniel's nephews, all 3 of them chasing something, a ball, probably, or the last of the afternoon. She made a sound that was entirely joyful and entirely unself-conscious, the particular sound of a child who has nothing to be afraid of in the moment she is in. Daniel heard it and felt something settle in him, the specific settling of a thing that has found its right place after a long time of being somewhere else. The maple leaves came down around them. The year turned toward winter, and the town of Maplewood, Vermont, moved through the afternoon in its quiet and patient way, holding the whole small story of it: a bus stop, a decision, an $18 bill passed between 2 strangers who had, without knowing it, been exactly what the other one needed. The bus stop on Maple Street got a new bench the following spring, installed by the town in a routine infrastructure update. It was a standard green metal bench, identical to the one it replaced. Daniel walked past it on the way to pick Lily up from school one afternoon in May and stopped for a moment. He did not know if anyone else in Maplewood would ever stand at that bus stop on a difficult afternoon and make the kind of decision that changes everything downstream. He thought, probably, that someone would. He thought that people generally wanted to be good to each other and mostly needed the right moment to demonstrate it. He walked on. Lily was waiting at the school gate with her star chart under one arm and a drawing she had made in art class, which she held up for him immediately upon seeing him. 2 stick figures, one tall and one small, under an arched sky full of careful yellow stars. "Who are they?" he asked. "That's us," she said, as though it were obvious. On a clear night, he took her hand and they walked home through the May afternoon. The drawing carried carefully between them, the sky above Maplewood full of clouds that were only clouds.